Hey TCAT, I wanted to share just a word about some things that ended up happening at our services yesterday to kind of give you some updates on some of our tech stuff. So have you ever heard of Murphy's Law? You know that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And we experienced that a little bit yesterday, especially during our second service here at TCAT when the screens weren't working and we had some sound stuff that was going on. Let me just say, these were some issues that we knew existed, and actually a week and a half ago we sat down, we made a plan, and we started ordering new equipment. And all of the new equipment has actually arrived, new soundboard, upgraded internet capacity, lots of live stream stuff to make our production value much better. But we didn't have time to get that stuff installed before yesterday. And so we kind of had that cascading effect where one piece went down, then the next, then the next. But going forward, all the new equipment has actually started going in this morning, and we won't have these issues hopefully again. But if you did try to tune into one of our services yesterday and you're not here in town, then you couldn't tune in because our stream didn't work. So we wanted to say we were sorry for that. The good news is we actually recorded the message on Thursday. We do a Sunday prep practice on Thursdays, so you'll get kind of a preview version of the message, and then actually going forward, we'll have week 3 this coming Sunday of that series to close out our time on comeback. So we appreciate your patience. We're praying that we can connect with you and stay connected with you soon. So God bless and have a great day. And so to start off round 2, I have a question for you. Have you ever taken a selfie? I'm going to guess you probably have. We kind of live in that culture, right? On my phone this past week, I was looking around and I found this on my phone. This is actually a selfie that my 4-year-old took. Of her and our kids, and how she got it framed right and got them to stand behind it, I have literally no idea, because when I take a selfie, it's like of my nostrils and like my face is all crunched up, or I look like Jabba the Hutt or something, and here's my 4-year-old like literally killing it as a photographer. But this selfie thing, usually when I find pictures in my phone when people have stolen it and take pictures, are usually not good, but this was like the best thing. It was like a wonderful nugget that I didn't even know existed. And, don't judge me because they're in a car. I don't know how they got in a car as my kids, but, anyway, right? Why do we take selfies? What is it that brings us to a place where we do this? Well, I think it's about capturing memories. And so earlier on Facebook, once I found this, I asked our community, I said, give me your favorite selfies. And here's some that popped up. So check this one out. Might recognize some of those faces, right? And check out another one. Here's this next one. This is actually Disney World, which I thought was super cool, but all these selfies are kind of posting with masks now because we're out in public. It hit me with the next one. Like, when did we start doing this? I think this one, show the next one. Look at this next one. I think between those two, this is that thing they call the duck face. I think a couple hundred years from now, when historians and archaeologists are looking back at this era of time, they're going to go, yeah, that's when the wheels fell off. That's when society began to crumble, right? Then we got to go around and we got to do this kind of duck face, duck lip thing. But again, it brings me to this question: why do we want to do this? Why do we want to take selfies? Narcissism, maybe, right? But I think it's a little bit deeper than that. I think we actually want to capture the moment. We want to capture the moment. There's things that happen in our lives where we're like, man, that's just such a special thing. Like, I'm thinking about that family that was standing at Disney, or that grandma that was holding her grandkids. It was just a really special thing for them, and we all want to capture those moments. I think it's so we don't forget. I don't know about you, but I'm really good at forgetting things. And it seems like as soon as something good happens, I kind of catalog it for a moment, and I think about it, and then it's just gone. And so I think selfies are our way of kind of trying to memorialize the moment, so we don't forget. And what I'm about to tell you over these next 30 minutes, that's it. That's the message of the day, is memorialization like that. But let's back up for a minute and let's talk about last week. Okay, so here's the big theme of our series. You may be down, but you are never out. Right? We're talking about comebacks. And we're talking about this idea that God has more for our story than what we have resigned ourselves to live. That there's more going on, and that God has more planned for us than maybe we're experiencing right now. And that the big thing is that the comeback that you're waiting for is not as far away as you think, because God's right here. And last week we told the story of this amazing character, the woman who met Jesus at the well, who got her comeback because God is a God who specializes in comebacks and come from behind victories. And so she was able to have this amazing experience with Jesus by kind of opening herself to where she was and admitting what she'd experienced, but then realizing that Jesus was there to give her the comeback she so desperately wanted. And then we talked about this idea that we as Jesus followers can be anything is possible people. right? That because anything is possible with God, then we can be anything is possible people. And then we talked about this idea that ultimately what we wanted everyone to walk away with last week was hope. And I told you that you may not have come in with hope last week, but that God could give space for you to experience hope. And it was amazing to me to look around. I was standing up here last week, and I watched you all stand, and I watched you pray for each other. And I know some of you walked out of here with hope last week. Now, if you weren't here with us last week, and this is maybe your first time coming in, I want to tell you something that I think is really, really important about our message for today. Today is not just for people who need a comeback. Today is not just for people who are, in the down and out moment. Now, it will be particularly important for all of you who are in a down and out moment in desperate need of a comeback. But this is a message from God, I think, that applies to all of us, no matter where we are. And also, just for the record, today is not just for people who are already following Jesus. In fact, if you're not a Jesus follower, you have come to the right place. You came to just the right place at just the right moment for you. Because today is about preparing. Last week we talked a lot and experienced the emotion and kind of opened ourselves to what it feels like to be down and out. And so a lot of us started our comebacks. I asked you to come back here with you today with that little sheet of paper written down with that thing you desperately need a comeback from. And you got that with you, hopefully, today. Or you wrote it down in a journal, or you somehow you wrote it down to memorize it, and you brought it back here with you today. And so today is about preparing. Now, for some of you that are needing a comeback, today is about preparing to get out and to lead and lean into that comeback. But for some of you who aren't in need of that comeback yet, today is about preparing for the moment when you are. Because here's the thing that all of us like to avoid, but it's just the truth. All of us are going to get knocked down at some time. Your life will not be rainbows and butterflies 24 hours a day. I'm really sorry. If you've lived like that now, chances are that it's not going to last forever, okay? And so today is about preparing for those moments when we feel knocked down, when we feel down and out. Now, last week we talked a lot about how with God we're down but we're never out. And we spent a lot of time talking about what down and out feels like. And here's the word that I want to bring us to today. I think down and out feels dark. And what I mean, like, it just feels like the light has been robbed. Have you ever felt that way? Like the light has just been robbed from your life. When you're down and you're out, it feels like a really dark moment. It feels like a difficult, hard, dark moment. And the light has just kind of been stripped away or pulled back. And you're sitting there left kind of vulnerable in a dark place. Here's something else that I know about us as human beings. Our tendency is to doubt in the dark what we've learned in the light. Now, I'm going to unpack that for a while, but let's just start with something really simple. Do you remember what it was like to go to bed as a kid? If you're a parent, do you know what it's like to try to put your kids to bed right now? Like, let me give you an example of what happens in my house. So we do bedtime routine the same way every night. Bedtime is my thing. I get to hug the kids and tell them stories and tuck them in and tell them goodnight. And the same thing happens every night. It has happened almost every night that I've been a parent now. And what happens is this: I tuck them in, I read the stories, I turn the lights off, I walk away, and not 5 minutes later, some child in my house is going, "Dad, Dad, Mom, Dad!" And we get up and we run in their room and we flip the light on, because what had happened while we were gone is we turned the lights off and that thing in the corner turned into a monster, or there were spiders crawling around the ceiling, or there was a monster under the bed, or a weird noise happened outside, which meant something was about to get them, and they scream and they yell for us. And as soon as we flip the light on, you know what they do? "Hey, Dad, everything's fine. It's fine now." Right? It happens every time. Seriously, every time. I'm like, okay, like, look, the thing that you thought was a monster was really just your jacket draped across your chair, and the noise that you thought you heard outside that was something coming to get you was actually just the tree branches scraping against the hall. And it was like this moment where everything was fine when the lights were on, but the second we turned the light off and we got in the dark, they began to doubt what they had learned in the light. They began to be afraid about what they'd experienced. And I'm going to guess, like, you probably remember doing that as a kid too. I'm 35 and I still do that sometimes. I'm not the best at sleeping alone in the dark. It's not my favorite thing in the world to do. But the same thing applies with our relationship with God, because we often forget what God has done for us in the light when we find ourselves in the dark. Hear me out. When we get in those places where we're down and out, when we feel like we desperately need a comeback, we've probably forgotten all of the comebacks that God has brought us before. We've forgotten that God has come through before. We forget. Because it's an honest thing that happens. We're so consumed with this thing that we're facing and the difficulty that's in front of us that we just can't see past it. And I get it. Look, I'm not belittling your situation. I completely get it. I've been there. I felt that. I felt that within the last 2 months. But we get to this place where we just forget. It's so hard and it's so difficult and it's so dark that things are happening in a really weird way, and we just forget. We're in the dark. We find ourselves in the dark, and it's scary. And I get that. But we do this thing where we forget that God has come through before. But here's the thing that I've learned in my walk with God, and maybe this is where you are too. We may forget how God has come through before, but we never forget what God didn't do. Fair enough? We never forget what God didn't do. I don't know why that is, but it's just the reality of the way we live our lives. And if you've been around the church long enough, I'm going to guess you've probably been in a moment where you've asked God to do something, and it might have been even something really big, and you asked him to do that really big thing, and it didn't happen. And you can remember that more than the times that God came through. You can remember that more than the times when God did exactly what you needed him to do, or that he showed up and everything was amazing. We never forget what God didn't do. And I think that just kind of taints the way we look at the dark. I think that forgetting about what God has done that's been good for us and never forgetting the things that we wish God had done, it really just, when we find ourselves down and out, it really puts us in a weird place. It makes us forget. We forget that God could be faithful while we're in the dark. God is actually capable of being faithful. We forget that thing that we talked about last week, that we could be anything is possible people, because anything is possible with God. It's just really hard to see that when you're in the dark. And if you're sitting in this room this morning in desperate need of a comeback, in desperate need of God intervening in your life and doing something big, you've got that thing written down on your piece of paper that you're just desperate for God to fix. It can be hard for you to remember, but God has probably come through for you before. And I've just found, and this is just honest, that one of the biggest catalysts, once we find our hope, right? We talked about hope a lot last week. The next catalyst is really just remembering that God can be faithful. We got to stop doing this thing where we only think about God's failures and not his faithfulness. We got to move past that. We got to move past this idea that the only thing we can remember is when God didn't show up, not when he did. And I think that's the challenge of the story for today that I wanted to give you. This story really brings to bear this really important facet for us that we need to remember, is that the light and the dark are incredibly connected. They influence one another. That what happens in the light and what happens in the dark are incredibly connected and have incredible influence on one another. So we're in a good place where we feel like God has come through and we don't feel like the world is pressing in on us, we oftentimes forget about the dark. But we're in the dark, and the world is pressing in on us, and we feel like everything's kind of coming apart and falling apart at the seams. We forget about the light. But they're incredibly, incredibly connected, and I think our story is going to kind of bring that to bear today. So here's the question, right? How do we prepare for dark times? How do we prepare? Is there a way to prepare for when it feels like the world is falling apart? Is there something we can do prior to our knocked down, down and out moments that would help us to live through those in a better way? Is there something we can do while we're in a comeback moment, while we're stuck down and out? Is there something we can do? Preparation we can have in our own heart to use that hope to our advantage. And I think it's just simply this: light can bring hope in the dark. Light can bring hope in the dark. God can bring hope in hopeless situations. And remembering how he's come through before can help you get through the moment that you find yourself in right now. Now, here's how I want to do this. I want to tell you a story. And I have to kind of confess to you all that I am an Old Testament nerd. So the first part of your Bible is some of my favorites. I'm not saying I don't love the New Testament. I'm not saying I don't love Jesus. That's not what I mean, okay? But the stories of the people that you can find in the Old Testament, I was like, wow, I just so relate to them. And I want to tell you the story of a group of people today that we're constantly forgetting. They forgot everything all the time. And they were people that, like, God did literal miracle, amazing things right in front of them. And a year later, they're like, oh, God, help us. Do you have any power at all? And I just can't even imagine this dichotomy, this picture of them like forgetting God has showed up and he made it rain bread from the sky, or he gave them like quail up to their nostrils is one of the stories that happens, like they were in desperate need of food, or he made water literally flow from a rock. Like there was this moment at the beginning of these people's story where they were actually in slavery in a country called Egypt. They were all in bondage. They were all in chains. And God sent Moses. And I told you a little bit about Moses' story last week, but Moses comes and he cries out to Pharaoh. If you've seen the old Charlton Heston movie, like, let my people go. That whole moment happens, and this group of people are freed. They're set free to go. And so they go out and they're running away from Egypt, and they come up against the Red Sea. It's this giant, like, ocean-like lake, okay? And they're stuck because the Egyptian army is actually starting to pursue them, and they're just crying out, God, help us, what are we going to do? And so God parts the waters. It's an amazing miracle moment that happens. God literally takes the water and spreads it apart, and they cross across the sea on dry land. That's kind of the backdrop of the story that I'm about to tell you now. And here's the thing that I want us to get through our heads really quick. We're a lot like them. We are constantly forgetting. They didn't have phones to take selfies then, but I think even if they took selfies, they would have accidentally deleted them or filed them in the wrong file, and they still would have forgotten. That's kind of the things that we do. We're constantly forgetting. And so here's the story I want to tell you. It comes from Joshua chapter 3. And the backdrop again is that these people have been wandering after that moment. So God brought them out of Egypt, and he brought them he was going to take them into the promised land, and then they were too afraid to go. So they okay, well, let's just wander around for 40 years until you get your act together, was the story that God gave them. And so they've been wandering for 40 years, and Joshua has taken over from Moses, and God said, it's time for you to go to the place that I've promised you all along. And so they're journeying together to this place they call the promised land. And they get to the river. There's a river that's right in the way. And again, here they are, like they're getting ready to cross the river Jordan. And in Joshua chapter 3:15, I just want to read you, like the detail in this is amazing. So I want you to just kind of catch this for a minute. So look at this in Joshua chapter 3. It says, now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. So this probably means it was like April or May. And flood stage means that the river was probably 13 to 15 feet deep and probably 300 feet wide. So like football field wide. This is not Oregon Trail where they could just kind of ford it, okay? This is difficulty. And so there's this, impassable river. And the people are starting to cry out like, oh no, what are we going to do, right? And how are we going to make it through? And God wants us to go someplace we can't get to. Well, Joshua tells the people to start heading towards the river, right? And so they gather up at the banks of the river, and Joshua tells the priests that are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And if you've seen Indiana Jones, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it's this big golden box that they thought God's kind of presence lived in. And they said, okay, start carrying it and step out in the river. And the scripture tells us that the second that the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, when their foot touched the water parted. And what's really cool is it says the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan. While the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So here's what happened. They step they step into the water, and it piles up on one end and disappears on the other end. And here there's this massive moment where the water just completely disappears. It's this huge river, right? And look, if you're in a place where you're like putting your arms up and you're like, I don't know if I believe that story, like don't miss the point of this message because you don't believe the miracle. Look, these things can happen. There was actually an earthquake in the 1800s and another one in the 1700s that stopped the Jordan River from flowing. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe it's not. I don't know. All we have in the scriptures, it says that the river stopped flowing. Either way, this happened, and it has happened before. But if you choose not to believe this story, don't miss the point. I choose to believe it. I choose to believe this is something that God did that was miraculous, but don't miss the point. Listen to what happens next. This is the coolest part. So while all of Israel passed by until the whole nation had completely crossed on dry ground, 2 million people crossing the Jordan River on completely dry land. And here's the funny thing. They're crossing the river the whole time going, oh my goodness, God, you finally came through. And I can't help but think, like, God's like, finally? What do you mean, finally? I've done this before. I've done this very thing before. I brought your ancestors across the Red Sea before, right? But they just kept forgetting instead of like crying out, oh, thank God that you finally came through on our behalf. And there's God again going, I'm here. I parted the waters for you before. You remember when you were a kid? Here's the thing. We oftentimes we get what we want and then we forget about it. And we're on to the next thing so quickly. And that was the story of the Israelites. And I feel like that's kind of our story too. the second we get what we want, we kind of are on to the next thing. Remember when you were a kid and all you wanted to do was grow up? Those of us that are grown-ups, like, that was a bum deal. I can't imagine, like, I want to be a kid again. I'd like to go live in my blanket fort and never have to do adult things again. In fact, I've been guilty of telling my wife, like, I just don't feel like adulting today. It's not my thing. But remember, like, once you finally grew up and you wanted to grow up, the next thing you was like, I really want to own my own house. Living in an apartment was, like, terrible. I loved my roommate and we had a lot of fun, but, like, living in an apartment was the worst, and I couldn't wait to own my own house. But in the middle of that, like, I bought a house before I got married, and so then I found myself like, I just really want to get married. You remember that feeling, like, you just really want to find that right person? And in my case, I'd already found that right person, but I was just ready to get married. And then it was funny because then we get married, and you know what? It's like, we really just want to have a child. We want to have our own child. We want to have kids. We want to be parents. Wouldn't it be awesome to finally be parents and it's on and on and on and on. Every time it's been one thing onto the next. You get what you want, and then you want something else. That's been the story of my life. And I think this moment that the Israelites had with God, God's going, I've already parted the water before, but you missed it. I've already shown up and brought you out of this mess that you were in. I've already done this. I've already done amazing, miraculous things. You just missed it, or you just forgot it. You're on to the next thing. And the temptation for all of us is to just kind of forget. We just forget what has already happened, especially when we find ourselves in a mess. You know, we talked last week about getting to a place where we say, God, only you can fix this mess. I think it's easy for us to get there. The step that I'm trying to get us to today is trusting God to do it. And I think the way that we trust God to do it is by remembering that He's already done it. So here's what God did, and this is like the coolest thing. I feel like God was kind of leaning in and going like, look, I've already parted the waters for you. I've already made it rain bread from the sky for you, and you've forgotten. So we're going to do something different. We tried this with you. Let's do something different. So he tells Joshua, he says this, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and then have them take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan. Now, picture the scene for a minute, okay? 2 million people have walked across this 13 to 15 foot deep river, and he asked 12 of them to go back. So the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant are still standing there with this 15-foot wall of water next to him going like, is this thing going to hold? And so he says, take 12 men and send them back into the middle of the river. So they probably chose the 12 most gullible men they could find and sent them back out into the middle of the river, and they were supposed to pick up stones. They were going to pick up a stone apiece, and these were not like little like pebbles. These were like, okay, you get that in and I'll get this in and we'll carry it together. 12 big stones, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. And here's the best part. In the future, when your children ask you, because they will, what do these stones mean? Tell them. In the future, when your kids ask, what happened here? What was this moment? Tell them. Tell them the story about how your God brought you across the river. Tell them the story about how God didn't give up on you. Tell them the story about how God was there when you needed Him to be. And every time, and the scripture goes on to say eventually that by the time this book was written, those stones were still there to that day. They were still there to that day. And they were a memorial. They were a remembrance. They used those as a way to go, I will not forget that God showed up. Now, why would God do this? I think it's because God doesn't want you to doubt in the dark what you learned in the light. He doesn't want you to doubt. He doesn't want you to forget. He doesn't want you to think that He won't be faithful. He's going to be faithful. He has been faithful. He will be faithful. And He doesn't want you to doubt when you get in those difficult moments. He wants you to be able to look back and say, look how I came through for you. I'll come through for you again. And so what I want to encourage us to do, like here's the thing. I want us to encourage you to come up with some way to memorialize the way God has been there for you. Now, some of you who are sitting in this room right now, maybe this will be the first time God's come through for you. You find yourself in a comeback moment. You're knocked down and out, and you're laying on the mat, and you're waiting for God to come through. Maybe this will be the first time. This is great for you because you can think right now of a way to remember this. But you come up with some way to memorialize what God has done in your life so that when you find yourself in the dark, you can go back to that. You can go back to that moment. You can tell the story. You can remember That God has been faithful before and will be faithful again. Maybe for you it's like an actual physical place. One of the things that I do when I feel like I'm kind of down and out, when I feel like I'm struggling, is I go back to the woods. I go find a place to go hike. I go find a quiet place in the woods, and it's an actual physical place. There's actually one place on my old family farm that I love to go to. It's hours away now, so I can't do that anymore. But there was this place that actually means a lot to me because it was a place where I started to hear God speak to me about my future, about what he wanted me to do and who he wanted me to be. And I'll go back there. Like when I find myself in a hard time, I remember, God spoke to me when I was there, and I want to go back there again. I've talked to people this week when I asked them this question. They said it's like, they got to drive by something. Maybe you got to drive by your old house. Maybe you got to drive by an old office you used to work in. I don't know, something like a little quick trip. It's an actual physical place. What can you do in an actual physical place to remind yourself of how God has been there before? Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a favorite verse of Scripture. Maybe it's just like this verse of Scripture that just like really speaks to you. And every time you're down and out, you need to go back to it. Maybe it's something like a poem that you repeat. When I was a kid, my mom gave me this one. It was kind of a silly thing, but like every time something really difficult happened and I found myself kind of scared or like afraid of the dark or whatever it was when I was a kid, she would just say, well, remember, Jesus died at Calvary. He shed his blood for you and me. And I did this thing where I would just recite it over and over and over again in my mind. Every time I got scared, every time I got afraid, I would just take that phrase and I would just over and over again say it. And it became like a memorial for me. It became a remembrance thing for me. Maybe it's not a verse or a place. Maybe it's an item. Maybe there's something that you have wrapped up in your story with God. Shannon and I were in a car accident while we were dating, coming back. It was my very first time meeting her parents. And she was driving me back to Lexington. It was this horrible, horrible rainstorm. I was in the passenger seat. She was in the driver's seat. Neither one of us had ever been in an accident before. A car in front of us stopped short in the middle of the road, spun out, and she just creamed them, absolutely creamed them in her little 1999 Toyota Camry. And it totaled it. It was done. It was completely totaled. We were miraculously safe. Like nothing happened to us. The car was destroyed. But I got out, and she would have gotten out if her door hadn't been stuck. I like this part of the story because what I ended up doing was reaching over and ripping the door off of her car. He-Man, right? And so it was a really powerful, cool memory for us. So the funny thing was, she didn't want to remember that. But my father-in-law, who saw us miraculously protected, the car was totaled, so he took the wheel off the front, the rim, and he painted it green, and he stuck it on the side of his house. Is he put his garden hose on it and a couple of things, but it was just stuck on the side of his house. And every time we'd come by, he would tell the story about how we should have been hurt, we should have been killed, we shouldn't be alive, but God protected us. And that was an item, that was a way he remembered. I talked to another young lady recently who had a terrible car accident, and she took the door handle off of her car. She should have been killed. She shouldn't have survived. She took the door handle off of her car, and she sits it on the mantle. And every time she begins to doubt, every time she begins to be afraid, every time she feels like God might not be faithful, she looks at that and goes, God has been faithful before. Maybe it's a journal. And I know immediately every guy in the room went come on. Journaling, that's kind of like a girly thing. I don't know about all that. Well, it's not, okay? It's an everybody thing. So maybe you need to write down those stories. I like to journal. I like to write things down. I will admit I'm not as good at it as a lot of other people because mine are usually bullet point lists. But maybe you just need to make a bullet point list of the things and the times when God has been faithful to you, right? Maybe it's not just a journal. Maybe it's a song. Maybe maybe you're like me, when that Three Doors Down song, Here Without You, comes on, and it's your and your spouse's song, and you look at each other and you chuckle, and you just think about is that just me? I don't know. That's our song. Maybe it's Faithfully by Journey when it comes on the radio, and you're just ooh, this is our moment. This is our story. Maybe you got one of those with God, right? Maybe there's a song, a hymn, if you're old school in the church and you love hymns, maybe it's something we've played here on Sunday morning. Maybe it can become the comeback song that Jamie wrote. Maybe it can be the champion song we've been singing. I don't know, but maybe there's a song that just speaks to you about when God has been faithful and God has been present, and you just feel that in that song. And every time you feel down and you feel out and you feel afraid, you can sing that song. It may sound awful, but you can sing that song, or you can listen to it on the radio or find it or something. Write the lyrics down. I talked to somebody this week who has what they call a God box. And this was an awesome idea. They take memories of things that have happened in their past when God has been faithful, and they put them in that box. they put them in that box. One of the amazing things that happened to me last year was that I had the great opportunity to go to the Holy Land, to go to Israel, to visit Jerusalem, to go to Bethlehem and see all these historical places where Jesus walked and where the Apostle Paul walked and where the apostles lived and where the disciples lived. It was just an amazing experience. And one of the dumb things that we did while we were there, I guess it's legal, I hope we took a rock from every city in town that we visited. Now, part of it was because my son's a huge fan of rocks, and I wanted to tell him the story and say, this rock came from the Dead Sea, or this rock came from where Paul was in prison, or whatever, right? But we took a rock, and we put them all in this box, and we labeled them, and we told the story to our kids. This rock came from a place where Jesus could have literally stood on it. This could be a real thing, and it was an item. It was something we put in our God box. Here's my point, and I don't want you to miss this. You will waste this time. You will waste this time if you walk out of here and do nothing. You will waste this moment if you walk out of here and do nothing. If you find yourselves like the Israelites, waiting for God, just waiting for him to show up and praying that he will, and you don't think about the times that he's shown up before. Or if you're in a comeback moment and you don't think God has shown up before, if you don't memorialize this moment where God is bringing you out, where he's now planting hope in your heart that he will be faithful, and planting hope in your heart that this will get better, and planting hope in your heart that the darkness won't last forever but the light will come, if you don't memorialize this, if you don't find some way to remember, you will forget. And you will waste your time. You will waste your time. And, I don't want to see you do that. You need a memorial for the anything is possible God. You need a memorial to remind yourself constantly that God is in control and that God is faithful and that God hasn't given up on you and anything is possible with God. And if we're really going to be, my prayer for TCAT, if we're really going to be anything is possible people, then we have to remember that anything is possible with God. So what is that thing for you?